that all right, or what?
Oh, yeah, finally. I said when we got in the car, I said, well, you want us to take you to the hospital or home? You didn't want to go to the hospital.
All right. Well, if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Psalm 1. That's where we'll be. And so each time each Sunday we'll go through probably just one psalm because there's a lot in each one. Sometimes we'll go through maybe 2, maybe 3, but probably most of the time just one. And so I think this will be really good.
Are you going to be here this summer?
What?
Are you going to be here this summer?
Yes.
Oh, good, because
Yeah.
Psalms is long.
I know. Right, so there are some Psalms where there's just not as much detail, but there are other ones where there's a lot. And so I definitely want to make sure we take our time going through these. And so, yeah. Don't worry, I don't know if we'll get through all 150.
Halfway through.
Yeah. Yeah, I really have no idea how far, because I've got stuff on every single one, and I mean, that's a lot. So I don't actually know how far we'll get, but I think it'll be really good. And so on the handout here, I kind of have this introduction to give us some framework for how we're going to work through this. And so this is kind of just an introduction, this first part here, before we get into the first psalm, just to give you more of a background into it. And so the first part here is, what are the Psalms? So you have the Psalms, there's 150 of them, like we were just talking about, but they're split up into 5 separate books. And so the first blank there, the first book is Psalm 1 through 41. The second book is Psalms 42 to 72. And then book 3, 73 to 89.
May I ask a dumb question? Why is it divided up like that? Are each one of them talking about something different?
So that's not a dumb question at all. So they're split up because of different themes, or sometimes different authors, or stuff like that. So yeah, they're kind of talking about different things, or there's just different themes, symbolism used in different ones, and so that's why they're split up.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And we'll get into more about how they're in order and what order and why they're in separate books, stuff like that. So, great question. Book 3, 73, 89, we got that. And then the fourth one is 90 to 106. Which means the last one, the fifth one, is 107 to 150. And so, the vast majority of these Psalms were written between a span of 800 years. So, in the time of Israel, pretty much all of them, except for maybe just a few, were written after the exile in Babylon, so after the 5th century BC. And so, as a whole, they span a huge wide range, but most of them were like the time of David. Because David, and as we'll see in the next part, is one of the primary authors. And so there are 6 authors, give or take a few, primary authors that have written the Psalms. So number 1 is David. David's written by far the most. And especially in book 1, David has written a ton of them. You've got the second author, they're called the Sons of Korah, so sons, just S-O-N-S, sons of K-O-R-A-H, Korah is what they're called. It's just a group of Jews, a group of priests, sons of Korah. So David, the sons of Korah, and this guy named Asaph, A-S-A-P-H.
At the front of Psalms in this Bible, it lists all these, and after it, it says like David-73, Asaph-12.
Oh yeah, it does. It actually gives you. That's kind of nice. Of the 150 Psalms, 100 of them are thought to be written by the following authors: David, Asaph, sons of Korah, and then we'll get to some of these other ones too. So you can see some of these other authors, they've only written one.
Oh, so David wrote 73, that's what that means.
Right, that's what that
Gotcha.
means, yeah. So David's written about half of them. So yeah, Asaph is that third blank, and then Solomon is the fourth one. The next blank is Moses. And then the last one is Ethan. And so yeah, it's kind of nice. In the front of the
Mhm.
Bible actually tells you some of the authors. It's kind of nice. So yeah, there's a lot of really minute ones like this Heman, the Ezrahite. That's a really niche one. He only wrote one, and then even Ethan is pretty small. But yeah, the main one is really David. But then there are some of these we just don't know who wrote them, and so that's just how it is. And so there's different books written by different authors, but there's also different genres of psalms. So even though they're all categorized as a psalm, there are different kinds of psalms. So the first one here, there's 6 different genres. The first one is personal praise. So praise. The first kind of psalm. Giving praise to God. So you have personal praise, but then you also have public praise. That's the second one, public praise. A third one is celebration. So these have all been pretty happy so far, praise and celebration. The fourth one is lament. Song of sadness, lament. Lament. You also have wisdom psalms. Solomon is the author of some of those because he was said in Ecclesiastes to be the wisest man to ever live. Wisdom. Number 6, the last one is judgment. Judgment. And so these are not the only 6, but these are the largest genres that we see. Then there are a few really small ones. But the Psalms are the most quoted book in the New Testament. Out of any other Old Testament book that the New Testament writers quote, the Psalms is the one that they quote the most. And so we'll see that a lot in our study. We'll see its uses in the New Testament, which I think gives it a fuller meaning. And so whenever we look through these, this last part, I really want to just give you the full structure for how we're going to look at these. So we're going to look at 6 lenses. Look at a psalm, so the first one today, Psalm 1, through 6 lenses for how to understand it and apply the psalm. So the first lens, we're going to look at the author. The first blank there is author. And so we're going to look at who wrote the psalm and how does that impact our understanding of the psalm. And so for a lot of these, we know that it's David that wrote them. And we can actually coincide when he wrote this psalm to when in his life he wrote it. And so we can know because David wrote some of the Old Testament, and there are other stories about David that we can say, you know what, he probably wrote this psalm around this time when this story was happening, and so that's probably why he's feeling this way, kind of stuff like that. So author. Number 2 is editor, the editor. And so this is kind of the question that Hartzell had. So the authors weren't the ones that put the Psalms in the order that they are. So somebody put the Psalms in this order in a very specific reason. So there's a reason why Psalm 1 is the very first psalm. And so basically the editor, whoever comprised the book of Psalms, 1 through 150, put it in that order for a reason. And so that gives it a fuller meaning. It gives it a more complex meaning by looking at the editor. And then the third one is theology. Theology, do you know what that word means? So theology, the first part of that word, if you just want to break it down, theo, is short for theos, which is the Greek word for God. So theo, God, and then ology is the study of. So it literally just means the study of God, theology.
See, I was gonna say preaching, theology,
Yeah, yeah.
so study of God.
Yeah, the study of God. And so, what does this psalm teach us about theology? What does this psalm teach us about who God is? We're going to be looking at it through that lens as well. So, theology. And then number 4, Jesus. 2 Corinthians 3 talks about how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and how you can't read the Old Testament fully without reading Jesus into it. And so we'll read this psalm and we'll see what part does Jesus play in this? How can we see Jesus in this psalm? So that's going to be another lens that we look through it. And then number 5, the New Testament. So like I said, the Psalms is the most quoted book in the New Testament. So we're going to see how the New Testament writers use it in the New Testament. And then lastly, personal application. What does this mean for us? What can we take from this? And so sometimes we'll look at all 6 for a psalm. Sometimes we'll just look at 4. Sometimes maybe 2. But it depends on which psalm gives us more than others. And so this is just a good introduction, I think, to what the Psalms are. And so let's go ahead and dive right into the first psalm. And so right here on your notes, you have an author, a purpose, or the situation in which it was written, and the genre. So these 3 things, I'm going to put that before every single psalm we go through to understand the background. And so this very first psalm, the author is unknown. We don't know who wrote it. The purpose, though, for it is to introduce the psalms. The editor put this as the first psalm for a reason. There's a reason why it's the first one, to introduce the psalms. And then the genre is wisdom. It is a wisdom psalm.
Isn't it kind of sad? I sit here and look, and the people that are here trying to learn these were the ones that pulled away from the church over there. And I think, where's all these other people that we thought we were bringing into the church?
Yeah, you've probably seen a lot of different things, different people, and that's hard. So I want to go ahead and read the psalm. So I'll just read it. It's pretty short. I believe it's
You're going to read Psalms number 1.
Number 1, yes. So verse 1 through 6, the first psalm. It's very short, but very important. So let's read. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So there you go, very short, only 6 verses. So first, here I want to look at details and movements of the text. So we're going to look at different figurative language, different parallelism within the text to help us understand what he's trying to say. And so in verse 1, just look at the first verse, there's a lot of parallelism here. And so you see his use of words. He goes, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. So he uses walk, stand, sit. Different motions here, walk, stand, sit. And then he also does the same thing with counsel. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. There's that parallelism there, counsel, way, and seat. And then even the same thing, you've got, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. 3 different types of people. Wicked, sinners, and scoffers. So that's verse 1. Verse 2, you see parallelism, but it's interchanged. And so, verse 2, he says, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. And so, he parallels the word delight, delighting in the law, delight, and he says in the second line, he meditates on it day and night. And then in the next parallelism, the law of the Lord is paralleled with the law of the Lord. So it's just 2 different ways to say the law of the Lord. He delights in it. What does it look like to delight in the law? You meditate on it day and night. That is what he's trying to say. So we can know that the law of the Lord is important. It is important. And so whenever we say the law of the Lord, do you know what the law means? So for the Old Testament, the law was the Torah. The law was the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's what they had as their Torah, the law. But basically, the Old Testament as a whole. The Old Testament was the law for these people, for whoever wrote this. The law means the word of the Lord. And so going on to verse 3 and 4, we also see parallelism. So verse 3, he talks about he is like a tree planted by streams of water. A tree has deep roots. A tree's not going anywhere. If there's strong winds, a tree's not going to move. It's going to stand there. But it's parallel tree in verse 4 with chaff. What is chaff?
Well, it blows away.
Yeah. What did you say?
Waste.
It's waste. It's waste. And so he says, not so the wicked, they're like chaff. And they're blown away by the wind. If you're rooted in God, you're like a tree. But if you're like the wicked, you just blow to and fro. You have no idea where you are. You're all over the place. And so then also planted by streams of water, paralleled with the wind drives away. And then I think we also see parallelism, verse 1 and 6. So in verse 1 he says, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, paralleled with the last verse of the psalm. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And so I think he's paralleling the counsel of the wicked in contrast with the congregation of the righteous. That is what he's paralleling. So let's look at some specific things here. So what does the author mean when he says judgment here? So he says in verse 5, therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment. So what does that mean? Does he mean eternal punishment? Is he talking about hell? Because he talks about the wicked will not stand in judgment. So if he's talking about hell, he's saying that the wicked will not be in hell. So I don't think that that's what he means. I think when he says judgment, we're not talking about eternal punishment, but rather he's evoking imagery of a courtroom. They will not stand in court because they're wicked. They have done evil. They will not get away with what they've done, I think is what he's saying. So courtroom imagery. And so another interesting part about this, we see it starts with, blessed is the man. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. And so what this phrase means, blessed is, it's this weird word called mockerism, is what it said there on your notes. Mockerism means blessed is. The Psalms start with this phrase 26 times in the book of Psalms. So out of the 150 Psalms, 26 of them start with blessed is. Blessed is. So this phrase, blessed is very important. Blessed is. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. And so I want us to look at verse 2 here. So verse 2 says, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. This word meditates here is very interesting. It's an interesting word. It's the Hebrew word is hagah, is what it's called, hagah, which means to murmur or mumble. So to kind of speak under your breath, or to just kind of say some nonsensical words, but so kind of like it's used 22 times in the Old Testament, and is used when describing the Israelites when they grumbled in the wilderness. So if you can kind of imagine the Israelites just wandering in the wilderness, and they're just like, oh, I'm so mad. You're just grumbling under your voice. It's that same word. So to murmur or mumble is what it means. And so I think it's important to point out that this word is verbal. It's a verbal word. Haggah means to murmur or mumble under your breath. And so I think it's interesting that they decided to translate it meditate. Because Haggah is a verbal word, but typically we think of meditate as a silent practice. We think that meditating means we have to be within ourselves, we have to be silent and reflective in our minds. But yet this word in Hebrew actually is verbal, and it says that that's not how they thought of meditation in that day. So I think it's interesting that the whole concept of reading silently, so just reading a book without saying anything out loud, you're just reading it, this actually wasn't a concept until around the 7th century BC. And so I think this goes to show how oral traditions and groups of people were. They would always talk about it. So like we talked about in the history, how they almost didn't want to write the New Testament down because they wanted to keep it an oral tradition, because people just talked about it. And so the fact that people didn't read things silently until the 7th century BC really goes to show how verbal and oral traditions were in that day. Augustine, who lived in the 4th century, so that we're talking the 4th century, like year 400, he wrote a story. He wrote of a story when he was reading silently one day. Somebody came up to him and said, "What is this sorcery?" They had never seen someone reading silently before. So even in the 4th century, it was still like not a super common thing for people to just read by themselves, which I think is really interesting. And so this tells us that the Torah, the law, was always listened to. It was an oral tradition. And so I think we can kind of rethink what meditation is, because to the writer of this psalm, meditate is actually a verbal practice. So we can talk out loud. Meditation doesn't necessarily mean we just have to be silent and read. We can actually express out loud, and maybe even to other people. And so that's a really big word.
Excuse me. Okay.
Yeah.
It says therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous.
Mm-hmm.
What's that really mean?
Yeah, so we just, I just talked about how judgment, what that word means, I don't think it doesn't mean eternal punishment. So I don't think we can read judgment and say it means hell. I think he's saying, he's evoking courtroom imagery. So he's saying the wicked will not stand in court. The wicked nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. So the wicked are not going to get away with what they've done. So they're not going to stand in court. And so I think that's what he means by judgment. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. And so another fascinating thing about this psalm, the first word of the psalm is blessed, which begins with the Hebrew letter aleph. Right there, you can see what it looks like, aleph. So that's blessed. And then perish, the very last word in verse 6, perish, begins with the Hebrew letter tav. The very first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is aleph, and the very last letter of the Hebrew alphabet is tav. So this first psalm is talking about how it's the beginning and the end of all things. The beginning and the end. I think it's a really cool symbolism.
I sometimes wonder where did our church fail? I mean, how many people are here this morning?
Okay, that's gonna,
What did you say? They died.
What did she say?
okay.
Well, I mean, when we started out, it seemed like it was pretty good, and pretty soon, I wonder why people left their church and came to our church if they're not gonna participate.
Well, Mom, most of those are gone now, and now it is more, I don't wanna say liberalism, but it's, you know,
It's just different style.
it's a different style. We want to be entertained. A lot of people want to be entertained at church, and they don't really read the Bible. It's more like a story. And I'm sorry, I might be saying things you don't think's right,
It's
but
okay.
that's what I see.
Mhm.
Because we don't want to be told we might be going to hell by the way we're living. Because we want to live the way we want to in today's world, because it's a me world.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And when you think about it, all the people that left the church, you're the only adult, the rest of us were kids. You're the only adult still living, so.
Well,
it's
and the old
next-
type ones, they were very into the word.
Exactly.
They wanted to do what they thought the Bible said was the commandment.
That's the way I think of the Empton ladies, how dedicated they were to this church.
I mean, there's a few other ones beside you that were adults, but that's the way it was.
So maybe somewhere along the line, we failed
Mhm.
in our teaching or something. Or the Bible says this is the way it's gonna be.
Narrow is the road.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, I think all churches have lifespans. And so I think naturally you're just gonna see all these ebbs and flows of different churches that are alive and then not so much and then alive and then they just kind of, but sometimes they just have to end. And how do I know that? It's because the churches that Paul planted aren't there anymore. And so, yeah. But, so getting back to the Psalm, Psalm 1:3, so I think we can kind of make a little guess of who wrote these Psalms. So I think we can either guess it's Jeremiah or Ezra. So let's, does someone want to turn to Jeremiah 17:8? And then someone else, Ezra 7:10. I know this is the Old Testament, so it's kind of hard to find some of these small books. Ezra might be a tough one to find.
What do you know about Jeremiah? I mean, that name.
Did you say Ezra?
Yeah.
For
Okay,
a long time.
What?
Ezra 7:10.
Okay. 17. You want me to read that?
First, does someone have Jeremiah? I have it if I
I
can.
will have
You
your
got it?
second.
Okay. So I think we can make a guess as to one of these two may have wrote it because of parallel passages written in their book. So do you have Jeremiah?
Yes, what verse?
17 verse 8. Chapter 17 verse 8.
17 verse 8.
Go ahead and read it.
He will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit.
That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? We're just talking about the tree planted by streams of water in verse 3. And then in Ezra, go ahead and read 7 verse 10.
For Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel.
Yeah, so in verse 2, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So I think we can at least say, well, there's some similarities here. We can't really be sure, but it's just some speculation. Maybe it was one of them. Just some parallels there. And so that's just some movements in the text that we looked at. And so next, I want to look through our lens of theology. So our study of God. What does this psalm teach us about God? And so I think, firstly, we can look at blessed is the man, and it says that he prospers. He says that the man will prosper. Those who are not wicked will prosper. I think we can say that God is benevolent. God gives us things. Often people in ancient times hated the God that they had to serve. They hated the God that they had to make sacrifices to. They hated giving sacrifice to them. But the God of Israel is benevolent and gives gifts. We don't have to hate him. We don't have to be afraid that he's going to do something to us. He's benevolent. We could be confident in that. I think we can also understand that God is knowable. We can know who God is. So based on verse 2, the law of the Lord, the Bible, or the law, is an extension of God himself. He has revealed himself to us in this book, so we can know who he is based on this book. So we can know God. I don't think we can know him fully, because he's way too big for our finite minds to comprehend. But we can at least know what he's like, at least a little bit. I think we can also know that God is just. So the question about the word of judgment in verse 5, therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. God is just. He will not let the wicked get away with what they've done. He will make them pay for it. He is full of justice. I also think we can know that God is omniscient. Do you know what that word means? Omniscient?
Lord knows.
He knows. So the word omniscient means all-knowing. So that word omni is all, and then niscient is to know. So he knows all things. So God knows everything that's happening at all times, everywhere. He's omniscient. The Lord knows. God knows even what it's like to be a human, which I think is really particularly interesting about Christianity. He knows what it's like to be a human. No other religion can say that their God knows what it's like to be a human. He is omniscient in every way possible. And so these are what we can know about God from this psalm. So next I want to look at the editor. So the person who put this psalm here for the reason that he did. So the Hebrew Bible is broken up into 3 books. So the whole Old Testament is broken up into 3 books. So the Torah, we already established, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books. Then you've got these weird words. The Nevi'im is the word prophet in Hebrew. So the prophets, so you've got the law of the prophets, both the minor and the major. And then you've got the Ketuvim, which means the writings. And the writings begin with the Psalms. And so you've got the 3 separate parts of the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And what I think is super fascinating is that all 3 of these divisions begin with the same imagery of a garden. All 3 of them.
Say that again.
All 3 of these divisions of the Old Testament, of how the Hebrews would have understood the Old Testament, all of them begin with an imagery of a garden. And so we'll look at this. So even in the beginning of the entire Bible, Genesis begins in a garden. And then in Revelation, chapter 22, there's a garden imagery. And so Psalm 1 was put as the first psalm for a reason, because there's garden imagery. So the Psalms were the Israelites' example of how to pray. But Jesus is our example of how to pray. So if you remember in the Gospels, Jesus says, this is how you should pray. And then he recites the Lord's Prayer. He tells us how to pray. But the Psalms were how the Israelites prayed. The people in the Old Testament times, that's how they prayed. And so that's the editor. So I think that's pretty fascinating looking at the garden imagery. And this is the reason why this was put here. So next I want to look at Jesus, the lens of Jesus. So verse 1 begins with, blessed is the man. Have we seen this before in Jesus' life? Blessed is. Without looking at your notes, where have you seen this? You probably already looked.
I did. Oh, the first Psalms.
Well, where else?
Oh.
In the New Testament, in Jesus' life, would he use this phrase, blessed is?
150.
in Jesus' life. So not in the Old Testament, but like in the Gospels.
In the Beatitudes.
In the Beatitudes, there you go, okay. So yeah, Jesus used this very phrase on the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes. In fact, the entire Sermon on the Mount is just an expansion of Psalm 1. It's an expansion of it. He starts every sentence with blessed is. So the people that were listening to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount recognize that he's using this language from Psalm 1. They recognize he's saying blessed is, blessed is, blessed is. He's using that mockerism, blessed is, to talk about, to teach. And so also, Psalm 1 talks about the way of sinners. The way of sinners, there in verse 1. So what is the way of sinners? What does that mean, the way of sinners? In that day, the way of sinners was those who didn't follow the Torah. So those who didn't follow the law, they were sinners. That was the way of sinners, to not follow the law. And now it is those who do not follow Jesus. That is the way of sinners. We follow a real person who lived in history, not just a book. And so if you can put yourselves in the shoes of a Hebrew back in the BC era, you followed the Torah. This was how you knew that someone was a sinner or not, whether they followed this. But now we can know through a person, because Jesus said he's the Word that becomes flesh in John 1. The Word becomes flesh. And then streams of water and yields fruit, this kind of language. Streams of water yields fruit. Jesus says in John 15, apart from me, you will bear no fruit. I am the true vine. And so I think a lot of Jesus' teachings comes from this psalm, a lot of it. And he evokes this imagery on purpose because he knows that the Israelites, the Jews of that day, they were very familiar with this song. They were very familiar with this language. And so he uses it to his own advantage to teach them that he is actually the Messiah. He is the one who is to come. And then I think, verse 3, he is like a tree planted by streams of water. Jesus hung on a tree. This psalm personifies wisdom as a tree. Jesus is wisdom incarnate, the ultimate example of wisdom. Jesus hung on a tree. He hung on the cross. And so I think that's how we can see Jesus in this psalm. So then our last lens that we're going to look at is application, personal application. Verse 3, he's like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season.
Don't you like the sound of that?
Mm-hmm.
Say that again.
Yeah, he is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruit in season. It just kind of makes you think about, if I remember whenever I stayed at the house, the family that I stayed at with in Ventura in California this summer, they had their own lemon tree.
Oh,
And they just would have lemons that would grow. In season, they would have tons of lemons, and it's just, they got so excited when you would see the lemons grow and you pick them, and it's amazing. We love fruit, we love it. But I think what this tells us, I think specifically it says, yields fruit in season. So there's a season for fruit, but there's also a season for not having fruit. And so we should move toward people that don't follow Jesus with compassion, because they don't know what we have. The most compassionate thing you can do is to share the gospel with someone and help them avoid eternal suffering. So it's really hard whenever we are in a season with fruit. We are just like, yes, it's great, give me. And then whenever there's a season where things are kind of slow, things don't really make sense, it's a hard season. You're not getting any fruit, and you're just like, why? I just want fruit. But we have to know that there's seasons in life. There's seasons for different things. There's cycles. It's moving. And so we just have to get through the seasons without fruit to get to the seasons with fruit. And then the plant yourself by streams of water. Jesus is the living water. I love the imagery of water in the New Testament. Jesus says, I thirst, when he's on the cross. We talk about these 7 cries of Jesus on the cross. One of them is, I thirst. I'm thirsty. Revelation 22, if we want to flip there, in that very end of the Bible, is the very last chapter.
You're talking about 22nd chapter.
The very last chapter of the Bible, Revelation 22. At the very beginning he says, Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And so talking about water, streams of water, this stuff matters. This is our life source. And so in the ancient world, they would build cities next to streams of water because you need a water source. You need a source of water. And so you wouldn't just build some city up in the mountains with no source of water. And so this is why even today a lot of the major cities are in junctions of rivers and lakes. This is why, because they needed water. And so people viewed water as a source of life. And so I love how the Bible compares this source of life with Jesus himself when he says, I thirst. And in Revelation 22, talking about planting yourself next to the river of life. And then in Psalm 1, planting yourself like a tree next to the water, the streams of water. The Westminster Confession of Faith, so I know we don't really have confessions in our tradition, but the Presbyterian tradition goes by this confession called the Westminster Confession of Faith. And it says that the whole purpose of life, he says, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Enjoy him forever. I love that. And in verse 2 it says, delight is in the law and of the Lord. That is our whole purpose, is to delight in the Lord. But what I love is that we don't just have to delight in the Bible. Because in the Jewish days, they just had the Torah. They just had a book to go by. But we have a person who lived in history. We have a person. And we can delight in him and in what he did for us. He died on a cross for us. We have the gospel. And then also I think very practically speaking, an application is how we shape friendships, how we view our relationships in our lives. It says, don't walk in the counsel of the wicked. I think those you spend the most time with shape who you are. I think we all know this. Don't befriend the wicked. Don't spend all of your time with people that tear you down. I think maybe we've all attested to a time whenever we had some people that just weren't very good for us, some friends that just would bring us down, people that would make fun of us or make us feel bad about ourselves. We don't need that, because that shapes us into who we are. So who are you spending your time with? That is who you're going to end up as. And so that is Psalm 1. Good stuff.